What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more punk rock. And we're going back to a classic album from my collection and my youthful teenage years of listening to punk, which is to say 10 Foot Pole's Rev. Now, I've talked about this before, but I haven't reacted to them in a long time, so just to reiterate for those unfamiliar, 10 Foot Pole were a band that had existed for about a decade before this album, mostly under the name Scared Straight. And then in the early 90s, they changed their name to 10 Foot Pole. Now, over time, they've had a, revolving door of membership. I think the lead singer, in fact, I don't even know if he was the lead singer, but there's a guy named Dennis. I think he's the only consistent member from the very beginning up until the present. And I think their most recent album is 2019. I'm not sure. But anyway, as I said, they started as Scared Straight. They eventually became 10 Foot Pole. And in that time, the early to mid-90s, the lead singer, I think, Scott Radinsky, was also a major league pitcher, like in baseball. And I think eventually his inability to tour as much as the band wanted led to him leaving the group. And I think he went to Poli, if my memory is correct, which is always dodgy. But 10 Foot Pole continued on with a new lead singer, and I don't know if that was Dennis or somebody else. In any case, the point is, I followed the group for Rev, which was the last album I think Mr. Radinsky was on, and then the two after that, Unleashed and... what's the one? I have it up here somewhere. Oh, The Insider. Or is it just Insider? Yeah, I think it's just Insider. And again, Rev, I think, is an all-time masterpiece. I think Unleashed is very, very good, even if it has a bit of a different sound. Insider I liked... and I guess this was partially because by then I'm starting to go to rave parties and, my musical interest, it became very busy and it wasn't easy to follow all the bands that I had been following. But regardless, I remember maybe not liking Insider quite as much, and as a result, I ended up not getting their next album and I kind of lost touch with the group. But then over the years, I've come back to their albums that I do own, especially Rev, quite often, because again, I think it's just a masterpiece. And I think all the reactions I've done have been from Rev. Maybe that's wrong. I might have done one from Unleashed. And if I haven't, I'll certainly go through Unleashed, because as I said, I think it is a very good album. In any case, we're going to listen to another one from Rev, 1994, and it's called Close to Grey. And I think the main meaning here is pretty clear, although I think there's some lines that you could maybe take some different ways. But it seems to be about someone, not the narrator, but someone the narrator knows, who is struggling with alcohol abuse to the point of their life falling apart. And there's lines about, he's jumped on the wagon before, only to then crawl and beg and so on, meaning, eventually went back to, trying to get alcohol and, falling into that addictive lifestyle. And there's also a line about, he's trying to crawl his way out of a paper bag, which, again, that sort of stereotype of people buying liquor at a convenience store or something where they have to, they want to drink it in public, but they, have it inside a paper bag. So, yeah, I think it's fundamentally about someone who just can't get away from alcohol abuse to the point of losing their sanity and their life falling apart. And there's lines near the end where it's like, he gets to the point where he doesn't care. He doesn't care if the people stare, and they do effing stare. So, yeah, it seems to be someone who's just... their own worst enemy, their worst demons are dragging them under and, making their life a living hell. And so, yes, it's a darker tune, but sonically it's very much in the territory of most of this album, which is to say kind of melodic, but still, fast tempo, like 90s punk rock. There is an exception, Old Man, which I know I reacted to that. It might have been the first tune from them I reacted to, which has kind of this, folk rock with a bit of a punk rock flavor sound. So, yeah, that is a bit of an anomaly, but most of the album is similar to what we're about to hear. Luca, you are adorable, but you're also ridiculous. So, yes, let's listen to it. This is 10 Foot Pole, Close to Grey. I mean, honestly, how are you supposed to react when your cat's staring at you like this? From their album Rev, 1994. get tired of cooking runs. We'll just have to wait and see. Cause he jumped on the wagon before, only to crawl and beg for more. His blood, just another casualty. His blood, just another casualty. Can you see beyond today's your first day? Do you remember how you'll feel tomorrow? All the people that you hate, all the times you've had to wait. Every piece of food you ever ate reminds you of your fate. And he's clawing his way out of a paper bag, reaching for the life that he never had. Ready just one step away, cause he's going backwards on a two-track. He's going one step forward and two steps back, getting closer to grave. In the end, there's only grieving. All his goals and pride pulled from thin air. Can you blame him if he's desperate? There's nothing left for him to get. And he doesn't care if the people stare. And they do. Fucking stare! And he's clawing his way out of a paper bag, reaching for the life that he never had. Ready just one step away, cause he's going backwards on a two-track. He's going one step forward and two steps back, getting closer to grave. 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 I love it. I really do love this album. Noticing the drumming there, there's a couple like double bass flourishes, there's also, some snare rolls leading into the next measure, and then at a lot of points throughout the track there's this, dancing on the hi-hat, which I enjoy. And yeah, melodic guitars. I really do like that section when it strips down. I kept waiting for it to start, but the interlude before it was longer than I remembered. But yeah, I do like the kind of stripped down vulnerability. It feels like more emotionally vulnerable in that part, which I think, fits with the lyrics. Now again, especially with punk rock reactions, I've thought about and heard a number of these albums and songs, going back now 30 plus years when I first got into punk rock. So I have a lot of thoughts about them, but I don't claim that, even some of my favorite bands, like Bad Religion, Propagandhi, Dead Kennedys, Subhumans, where I've listened to their songs hundreds, if not thousands of times, I don't claim that my views or interpretations are definitive or authoritative, and I am entirely amenable to the likelihood, or at the very least possibility, that my thoughts might run afoul or run in a different direction than the original, written meaning of the songwriter, and or a consensus or at least majority interpretation among other fans of the same band / song. But yes, that's what I take away from this. I did forget that crucial line that he's reaching for a life he never had, which I think, it could be just more in the moment, the idea that he keeps trying to get into a good place and, maybe be able to drink but responsibly and, sort of manage his life and, be on some level successful or at least, healthy, but he can't quite do it. But I think you can also maybe read an implication that maybe he comes from, a troubled background or, a broken family or, a very meager existence. His family was poor, or at the very least, he grew up around an alcoholic father or something like that. So the idea of reaching for a more normal and healthy life is something that he perhaps, always wanted but he just couldn't break away from the same cycles, the same dependencies, and so on. So again, that's speculation, but yeah, I feel like in that line you could maybe read a bit more into it. Nevertheless, again, I think it is fantastic. They say closer rather than just close to gray a number of times. I'm now second guessing myself, and I will say, goodbye, Luca. The print on here for my 45-year-old eyes is very small, so let me just make sure I'm not misremembering this and see if it is in fact close. Oh, it's closer. Yep, it is closer. Well, at least I figured that out while we're still here in the reaction, and I will know to label it correctly. So please excuse my opening where I said close to gray. But it makes sense, right? Closer as in comparative. It's like one step closer. And in fact, that line about, he goes one step forward, but two steps back. Like, so it's like every time he tries to get toward a more healthy and normal life, he actually ends up slipping back farther than he just went forward. And again, he's jumped on the wagon. I'm not going to drink anymore. Oh, but I'd really like some of that. And could you just give me a drink or whatever? And it's like, boom. Then he's going two steps back. So yes, closer to gray, ever closer to gray. So yeah, shout out to 10 Foot Pole. It is a great song. And again, let me just check to make sure that this was, yeah, okay, it was, yes. The last to feature Scott Radinsky on vocals, as the other members wanted the band to become a full-time touring band, and his baseball career was getting in the way of that. But I gotta say, that's pretty cool though, man, that he was a Major League Baseball pitcher in a career that lasted over 10 years, meaning he wasn't just kind of a fringe guy that like barely made it onto a team like one season. He was like an actual like veteran who, pitched in hundreds of games. And in fact, he had a winning record, 42 wins, 25 losses, not bad. Career ERA, or earned run average, of roughly 3.5. But yeah, okay, and so he still to this day, I guess, is the lead singer of Pulley. I do remember, yeah, it was the band that he transitioned to once 10 Foot Pole kind of moved on from him. So in any case, yeah, shout out to him, shout out to 10 Foot Pole, shout out to all the folks who've been following these punk rock reactions. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.